In what I'm sure is my most relatable admission yet, I live in a tiny apartment where, in yet another blow to my fragile mental health, my contract specifically forbids me from having pets. Or inviting the Yakuza over, apparently. Obviously this is a tale as old as time, and over the years there have been a wide range of products and games, dogs both robotic and Nintendo, keychain toys and therapeutic baby seals, all attempting to fill this gap in people's lives. But the gamification of these has always brought me a certain level of anxiety. My Tamagotchi will die if I forget to feed it? No thanks. I just want a nice chill little fella that I can look at and interact with now and then to bring myself some peace. Coincidentally, I stumbled across people making these holograms online not too long back, and that's when I thought to myself, what if I could make a real-life Pokemon? Alright, I'm gonna be that guy for a second. Despite a lot of the holograms you might have seen over the last decade or so, I'm sure you all heard about the 2-pack hologram at Coachella, for example. Hologram is kind of a misnomer. True holograms, like what you might see forms of on a passport or banknotes, are made using a complex technique of recording light waves with a laser and using chemicals to develop that, like a photograph. What's going on here is much more simple. There's a classic theatre trick which gained some popularity in the mid-1800s. It's called Pepper's Ghost, named for scientist John Henry Pepper. And despite being more historical than modern technology, it's still as striking to audiences now as it was back then. To give a brief explanation, a piece of glass or transparent plastic is placed at a 45-degree angle, with the viewer on one side and a brightly lit object or a person on the other side of the right angle. A screen works perfectly for this and can easily be hidden from view. The brightly lit thing that we want to project will be reflected onto the angled glass, with the viewer seeing it floating or standing in front of the background that they can still see through the glass. It's a straightforward technique, and while you might see it at big budget stage performances, or even on the Haunted Mansion ride at Disney, it's also something that you can make at home, utilising in all kinds of creative ways. So I have this old Nexus 7 Android tablet that I just use for reading now and then. It's pretty antiquated and slow. I'm sure you have a phone or something like it forgotten in the drawer somewhere. And Godot 4 should just about support this still, which will be much easier than putting together some sort of dedicated device with a microcontroller. So with that in mind, I get to work in Blender. I was keen to do this in 3D to get the full effect, and while I know that I could maybe have just ripped the models from a real Pokemon game, I did want to learn something from this. It's been a little while since I used Blender in any serious way, and plus it'll give me more of a personal connection to my new pet. I started out just with a simple egg to get to grips with the shortcuts again and experiment with the visual style on something simple. I knew that me UVs were going to be just god awful here, and didn't really care to spend all that much time getting them laid out nicely. So I just texture painted directly onto the model, using a low-res texture to get a nice pixelated look. I did experiment with some anti-aliasing, but in the end decided that that rough, chunky look was way more evocative of the old handheld feel that I wanted to go for. I know, more fake DS nostalgia. That's just me. I also decided to give everything smooth shading here too. I was worried that it would mean I lost that low poly look, but seeing them side by side, it felt right. With some of those big decisions made, I started out on my Magikarp. This little fella wasn't too bad to work on. I just started out with a cylinder, which I stretched out to the vague shape of the main body, and then I could start throwing additional shapes on top. Just box modelling from a cube, I made an eye, top and bottom fins, this side fin which was two separate parts for simplicity, same for the one at the back, and then some nice big kissable lips, and these whisker things. I used the horizontal mirror modifier on most of these so that everything would be symmetrical, and it cut out a bit of work for me too. Now I could really see if the way I was designing this was going to look any good at all. Onto the texture painting, and I quickly run into a problem. Remember before when I said I was going to kinda just let me UVs be a mess, and that I wouldn't have to worry about it because I was just painting straight onto the model? Well, it turns out that while that's all well and good for a mesh as simple as an egg, when I start trying to paint onto something more complicated like this, I quickly discovered that everything is warped, pixels look bigger in some places and smaller in others, pixels are on an angle, nothing lines up with the face next to it, it's a complete mess. Fortunately though, I discovered that there's an add-on called Pixel Unwrapper made just for art like this, that sets all of our UVs to the right pixel density and aligns everything perfectly in just a couple of clicks. Very good for getting a consistent look across multiple models too. I highly recommend it. With the UVs all sorted, it's just a case of painting everything up, which is a little fiddly, like sometimes a pixel you're trying to paint will take a few clicks to apply, but honestly I think the end result is looking pretty good. I do a quick render here, just for vanity, and I'm too scared of rigging to try doing that just yet, so I move straight onto the Gyarados. Gyarados was a lot tougher to get right. I think I took 3 or 4 tries at box modelling the head before I had to pull up some art in Procreate and trace over where I wanted the faces to be, as it's the only way that I could visualise it, and that worked a treat. So the reason that I'm doing Gyarados at all is because I kind of wanted this to follow the Tamagotchi template, having a pet that you raise and have to remember to feed, but I just can't handle the idea of my Magikarp dying and going belly up in the tank. I can't animate that, it would be so sad. So I decided instead that you would be able to gradually level up your pet, gaining experience points every time you feed it, and then when you reach level 20 it would evolve into Gyarados, and you could start again with a new egg. It's more of a lo-fi, chill vibes kind of game, which suits a fish pretty well, don't you think? So with each body section of Gyarados painstakingly painted, it's time to move on to the bit that I've been dreading. I've never done any rigging or 3D animation before. I know, it looks complicated, there's like a bunch of bones and weight painting and... Oh. So it turns out that you just add an armature and then subdivide it into parts, or just extrude new bones. That's... I mean, I know a fish is about as simple a skeleton as you can get, but I really did expect it to be more work than that. One problem that I did run into here is that when it came time to start moving the bones in pose mode, I still had each body part, like the fins and stuff, all as separate meshes. And it led to things twisting in a really unnatural way, so I had to use Bool Tool to quickly combine everything. I've done little rotation animations to show off models before, so creating the animations here felt pretty familiar. Just put the thing where you want it and keyframe. So I made a simple idle animation, swimming in place, and eating food from the top of the bowl. Alright. Now that I have all of my assets together, let's bring them into Godot. Oh, how I've missed you, my precious. I had this weird issue importing the models into Godot where it looked like the normals were inverted or something. They were fine when I checked, and I ended up just fixing this by overriding all of the surface materials. Don't know why that worked, but as long as it gets us there, I guess. I probably did some export or import setting wrong. Animations were looking fantastic though, which was a bit I was worried about. So all I had to do was make the background black by setting a custom world environment. After that, I get a basic menu set up. I don't really know if screen burn-in is a potential issue on tablets, but just in case I made it so that after a minute this just disappears until you touch the screen again. One fun thing to think about here is that since I'm going to be reflecting my models back towards the player, everything's going to need to be displayed upside down in order to be the right way up in the reflection. The menu though, I was just going to have peeking out at the very bottom of the screen for the player to touch, so that would have to be the right way up, resulting in this very confusing to look at screen where my camera is rotated 180 degrees while my UI is not. There was a lot of holding my laptop upside down in the development of this, just to double check that things were looking right. I set a timer where Magikarp wouldn't be hungry after feeding for a while, so that you couldn't just force feed him in order to level up, and added a little notification area to explain things like that. Then I decided to go back and tweak my animations a little. While waiting for the egg to hatch, I didn't want it to just sit there still, more jumping around like when they're getting close to hatching in the real games. I hadn't done any rigging on the egg, but all I really needed here was for it to compress and stretch out vertically while wobbling back and forth a little just by rotating. And with just those two in a little loop, I got something that looked really nice. With Magikarp, I had made this simple swimming animation, but with them just sitting in place, it didn't really look like much. So I added in another animation that would just slowly rotate the entire mesh around a central point, making it look like they were slowly making the way around the fishbowl, without a thought in that tiny brain. Okay, I can't avoid it any longer. It's time to figure out how leveling and evolution is going to work in this game. So in the real games, Magikarp is on the slow leveling rate table, meaning that they have 10,000 experience points at level 20 where they evolve. So if I want to follow this, how much XP should I be awarding per feed? I tried to average it out, like, oh, you might feed them 4 or 5 times a day, reaching level 20 in 5 days. But that works out to an insane amount of XP in the early levels, and you'd be skipping from level 1 to level 8 or 9 on the very first feed. It felt weird awarding different amounts of XP just at the early levels to avoid that, but what I ended up settling on was 100 XP per feed, but if that gains you more than one level, the amount of XP awarded will be cut to put you at the very start of the level instead. Now, 10,000 divided by 100 is still a whole lot of clicks, so I decided to award a small amount of XP on an idle timer, meaning that you'd be slowly leveling up over time, whatever, just so long as you have the app open. Okay, so I realise this is a bit of a convoluted system, so I did include an XP multiplier in the settings page, just so you can skip through things a little faster if you like. Evolution. So this pretty much comes down to swapping out the models, but just snapping from one to the other would be a bit unpolished, right? The easiest way I could think of to hide this and still feel like Pokemon was just to make a round sunburst texture. I can place one down on top of the other, have them rotate different directions, scale up to try and hide the switch, and then since the models are kind of too big for that to work still, have the models scaled down and then back up too, so it's more of a seamless changeover. Back to animations for a second. This really is a part of the project that I'm having to learn as I go along, so there's a lot of fiddling around here. I have my swimming animation, and I have my feeding animation, and I have an animation tree set up so that as soon as the feeding animation finishes, Magikarp goes straight back to swimming. But when they do, there's this really nasty snap from one animation to the other. And I spent a bunch of time trying out all these tools to blend animations together, and I just wasn't getting anywhere. Before I eventually realised that, once again, I was overcomplicating things. And all I actually needed to do was open this transition in the inspector, and set a short crossfade time. Then it looked perfectly serviceable. Man, I really lied to myself over the years about how difficult this 3D stuff would be. With that, it's just a few of the boring things to take care of. I set up a simple JSON file autosave and load, get a little stats page together, and add in a 1 in 10 chance that you'll hatch a shiny Magikarp, which is just a simple material swap. I borrow a few Game Boy sound effects for feeding, leveling up, and evolving, and we're done here. So, remember that old Nexus 7 that I wanted to run this on? Well, it turns out that it doesn't support Vulkan rendering, which Godot is pretty much all in on now. And while I could get it running in Godot's compatibility mode, which does still use OpenGL, it looked like this. Yeah, that ain't right. I'm not really educated enough to know exactly what causes these glitches. It could even just be a bug in Godot itself. I can't imagine many people are building for 32-bit ARM processors using OpenGL after all. But I did manage to fix it by disabling shading on all my materials. Obviously this isn't quite as nice looking, but it does the job. And I can just upload 2 separate APKs to itch, one for modern devices and one for older stuff like this. So, time to try it out. I got this glass plant pot which we'll be subbing in for our fishbowl, and cheaped out on the reflecting material by buying this sort of bendy project folder from Daiso. I do a very rough job of cutting it into shape and fitting it at an angle in the bowl. And to get a slightly nicer effect, I went online and bought the cheapest laptop privacy filter that I could, and cut that to the shape of my tablet, just to hide the original image a little bit. And here we go, my very own pet Magikarp. You can download the finished app on itch.io if you want to try out the Pepper's Ghost illusion for yourself. But if you're new here and want to see what I make next, then why not subscribe? I'd really appreciate it. But that's all for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you all next time.